The Catholic Church has elected 266 popes across 2,000 years of unbroken institutional history. One of those elections was decided while the winning candidate was, by most accounts, indisposed on a toilet. But why did the most powerful religious institution in human history build its sacred selection process around a moment of such spectacular, stone-cold, or 3 years in the making indignity? In the autumn of 1171, a man named Tidaldo Visconti was somewhere in the city of Acre, possibly crouched over a latrine, when someone knocked on the door and informed him that he was the new pope. Take a moment with that. The most powerful spiritual office in the Western world, the throne of St. Peter, the chair from which one man claimed authority over the souls of every baptized Christian from Scotland to Sicily, had just been handed to a person who was, by several historical accounts, indisposed. Not kneeling in prayer. Not standing at an altar. Not even sitting in a particularly dignified chair. Just a man in a crusader city, answering the most private call of nature, about to have his entire life interrupted. You know the modern ritual. The white smoke rising above the Sistine Chapel. The crowds packed into St. Peter's Square, the hush and then the roar. It is choreographed, solemn, and extraordinarily clean. The conclave today unfolds behind sealed doors with locked phones and sworn secrecy. A precise machine built over centuries to produce one sacred result with as little chaos as possible. The process that produced Tidaldo Visconti produced almost nothing but chaos. The papal throne had been empty for nearly 3 years by that point. 3 years. The cardinals had been arguing in Viterbo since 1268, locked in a palace that was, to put it gently, not improving with age. The smell of unwashed men in a sealed building during an Italian summer is not something any chronicle dwells on, but your imagination is capable. The food was bad, the tempers were worse, and the factions were completely irreconcilable. Local authorities, exasperated beyond all reasonable patience, had reportedly removed the roof to encourage a decision, then reduced the cardinals' food to bread and water. Still nothing. The cardinals eventually did what people do when every obvious option has collapsed. They delegated. They handed the decision to a small committee, and that committee, apparently freed from the paralysis of the full group, chose Tidaldo, a well-connected archdeacon who had the considerable advantage of not being present at any of the arguing. He was traveling with the future King Edward I of England on crusade, making himself useful at a safe distance from Italian politics. He was not even an ordained priest. This is the part of the story that deserves a slow, theatrical pause. The man elected to lead the universal church, to be the vicar of Christ on earth, had not yet completed the basic clerical prerequisites for the job he had just been given. And he received the news in Acre, possibly on a latrine. What this story is really about, underneath the obvious comedy, is what happens when human institutions push stubbornness past its breaking point. What rules get written in the aftermath? What systems get built to make sure that no one ever again has to remove a roof to get 24 men to make a decision? That is the story. And it starts with a very long wait in a very unpleasant room. On the 29th of November, 1268, Pope Clement IV died in Viterbo with very little ceremony and a great deal of consequence. He had been pope for 4 years, a former French lawyer and royal counselor who wore the triple crown with the exhausted competence of a man who had never quite wanted it. He died in the Palazzo dei Papi, a fortress of a building perched above the city like a gray fist, its stone corridors cold enough in November to make your knuckles ache just thinking about them. The candles guttered in drafts that came from nowhere. The walls sweated in summer and froze in winter. It was, in the most charitable possible description, atmospheric. He left behind a world that was, to use a precise historical term, a complete mess. The Papal States, those territories across central Italy that the Church claimed as sovereign ground, were politically fractured and perpetually contested. The great Hohenstaufen dynasty, which had spent generations threatening papal authority from the south, had only recently been dismantled, and the dismantling had left a power vacuum with sharp edges. Further east, the crusader kingdoms were doing what they had been quietly doing for decades, crumbling. The walls of the Latin East were holding, but barely, and with less conviction every year. Christendom needed a pope. Urgently. Actively. With some speed, please. What Christendom got instead was 20 cardinals in a room together. 20 men, which sounds manageable until you understand the geometry of the disagreement. The College of Cardinals in 1268 was split along a fault line so deep it had essentially become a feature of the landscape. On one side, the Italian cardinals, protective of Rome, suspicious of foreign influence, deeply committed to keeping the papacy anchored in the soil it had always called home. On the other side, the French cardinals, worldly, well-connected, backed by the considerable weight of French royal interest, and equally committed to their own vision of what the church should be and where it should face. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner, but the stakes are the immortal soul of Western civilization, and no one is allowed to leave. The smell alone would have settled in your clothing. Tallow candles, wool robes, the particular dampness of stone buildings in an Italian winter, and 20 men who had strong opinions about everything except how to compromise. The Palazzo dei Papi was not built for extended residence. It was built to impress, and there is a difference. This was the room that needed to elect a pope. This was the argument that needed to produce a leader. It would take nearly 3 years to do so, and the methods involved would permanently change how the church handled the problem of choosing one. By the spring of 1269, the cardinals had already proposed and quietly buried more candidates than most people have dinner guests in a year. The process worked like this, or rather, it failed to work like this. A cardinal would put forward a name, the Italian faction would consider it, the French faction would consider it, and then both sides would remember that they fundamentally disagreed about the direction of the church, the nature of political authority, and probably the correct way to slice bread. The candidate would be withdrawn. The room would return to its ambient temperature of cold stone and colder silence. Another week would pass. What made this particular deadlock so spectacular was that there were no rules forcing anyone to stay. Formal conclave procedure, with its locked doors and shrinking food rations and genuine institutional pressure, did not yet exist. These cardinals could leave whenever they pleased, and they did. They wandered back to their own households, their own correspondence, their own considerably more comfortable beds. They returned when guilt or reputation demanded it, looking slightly sheepish and no more willing to compromise than when they had left. The Orsini family led the Italian bloc with the quiet confidence of people who had been powerful in Rome since before the current century and expected to remain so after it. Against them, the Angevin-aligned French cardinals operated with the equally quiet confidence of people backed by Charles of Anjou, the French-born king of Sicily, who had opinions about papal elections and was not shy about making them felt. Two immovable forces. one increasingly embarrassing stalemate. Meanwhile, the cost was accumulating somewhere beyond the Palazzo dei Papi's damp walls. Without a pope, there was no head of the diplomatic structure that kept Christian kingdoms from each other's throats. Without a pope, the crusader territories in the east, already holding on through a combination of habit and desperation, had no central advocate, no organizer, no voice with the authority to demand another campaign. The walls of Acre were still standing. For now. Don't worry. It gets worse. By 1270, 2 years into the vacancy, the embarrassment had gone continental. European rulers were writing increasingly pointed letters. The faithful were beginning to ask reasonable questions about institutional competence. Viterbo, a city that had done nothing wrong except host this catastrophe, was now internationally associated with a church that could not govern itself. The cardinals, to their credit, seemed genuinely aware that this looked bad. They simply could not agree on what to do about it. It took the citizens of Viterbo themselves to finally introduce a new variable. Frustrated past the point of civic patience, they made some practical adjustments to the cardinals' living situation, the specifics of which belong to the next chapter, but the spirit of which can be summarized as, if God's representatives on earth won't choose a leader, perhaps God's representatives on earth would benefit from a little encouragement. The kind of encouragement that involves removing your roof. Raniero Gatti had a title, Captain of the People of Viterbo, and in early 1271, he decided to find out exactly how much authority that title carried. The answer, it turned out, was quite a lot. On his orders, the doors of the Palazzo dei Papi were sealed. Guards were posted. The cardinals, who had been drifting in and out of the building for nearly 3 years with the casual freedom of men who owned the place, were informed that this arrangement was no longer available to them. They were inside. They would remain inside. The election would conclude when God or hunger or the structural integrity of the building finally provided clarity. The cardinals were not pleased. They were princes of the church. They wore silk and commanded deference from kings. Being locked in by a municipal official was not part of how they had imagined their careers proceeding. Gatti was unmoved. The initial days must have felt merely uncomfortable. The palazzo was large enough, and the cardinals still had their attendants, their habits, their vestments, their sense of institutional dignity. They had, presumably, food. The inconvenience was real but manageable. They wrote letters of protest. They expected the situation to resolve itself through the normal mechanisms of social pressure that had always resolved situations for men of their standing. Then Gatti removed the roof. Not all of it, but enough. Sections of the ceiling were torn away, opening the interior of the palace to the Italian sky, which in the summer months is blazingly, mercilessly hot, and in the rainy season delivers exactly what you would expect from an open ceiling. The message was not subtle. There was no metaphor here. Gatti was not gesturing toward exposure. He was providing it. Imagine the smell after the first weeks. Heavy wool vestments in July heat. Men who had not bathed properly since before the sealing. The particular intimacy of shared confinement. The kind that strips away every pretense of dignity one layer at a time. The cardinals ranged in age considerably, and none of them had trained for this. They had trained for theology, for canon law, for the navigation of court politics. not for sleeping in a building with no ceiling while the sun made its daily argument overhead. Then the food changed. Bread and water. That was the new arrangement. Whatever complex negotiations and careful meals had accompanied the previous years of deliberation, this was the medieval equivalent of someone walking into the conference room and unplugging the catering order permanently. Bread. Water. Resume voting at your convenience. The physical toll was not theoretical. Cardinals began to fall ill. The combination of exposure, poor nutrition, summer heat giving way to autumn damp, and the baseline stress of confinement produced the predictable results. Multiple cardinals died during this period, not as dramatic martyrs, but as elderly men in weakened condition pushed past what their bodies could sustain. The college, already small, shrank further. Each death made the eventual two-thirds majority simultaneously more achievable and more elusive, because the required number shifted while the political fault lines did not. It would be easy, from a comfortable distance of 7 centuries, to find this faintly comic. The princes of the church undone by a leaky roof and a reduced lunch menu. There is something almost slapstick about it. But the men inside were genuinely suffering, and the institution outside was genuinely failing, and Raniero Gatti's audacity, breathtaking as it was, reflected something real: the frustration of an entire continent watching its spiritual leadership collapse into procedural paralysis. The citizens of Viterbo had tried patience. Patience had produced nothing. So they tried architecture. And slowly, painfully, through illness and exposure, and the grinding monotony of bread and rainwater, something in the room began to shift. What emerged from that damaged building would not be who anyone expected. The cardinals, stripped of comfort and running out of colleagues, were about to try something they had never seriously considered before: looking outside the room entirely. Acre smelled like salt, spice, and the particular anxiety of a city that knows it is the last one left. By 1271, the Crusader states had been shrinking for generations, their edges gnawed away by time and the Mamluk Sultanate until only Acre remained. A dense, polyglot trading port pressed against the Levantine coast like a man with his back to the sea and nowhere left to retreat. Genoese merchants haggled alongside Armenian pilgrims. Venetian ships loaded silk next to Frankish knights who had never actually seen France. The city spoke a dozen languages simultaneously and trusted none of them completely. It was, in other words, an excellent place to send a diplomat. Tedaldo Visconti had been born in Piacenza, in northern Italy, somewhere around 1210, which made him roughly 60 years old when he arrived in Acre, an age at which most men of his era were either dead or sitting quietly near a fire. Tedaldo was neither. He was a career churchman of the most useful kind. Not a cardinal, not even a fully ordained priest in the technical sense, but a papal legate with decades of experience smoothing over the kinds of ecclesiastical disasters that required someone trusted, tireless, and impossible to offend. He had worked in France, in England, across the slow geography of European church politics. He knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking, because he had occasionally helped with the paperwork. He had come to Acre on pilgrimage and purpose, accompanying Lord Edward of England, a young man who would eventually become Edward I and spend considerable energy making Wales and Scotland regret his existence. In 1271, Edward was still assembling his reputation, and the Ninth Crusade was his attempt to acquire the serious kind. The campaign had not gone especially well, as crusades in this period tended not to. The Mamluks were coordinated, experienced, and governing a unified territory. The crusaders were fractured, undersupplied, and had arrived with enthusiasm in rough inverse proportion to their reinforcements. Tidaldo served as something between a spiritual advisor and a diplomatic presence, the kind of figure every complicated military expedition keeps nearby, because someone needs to write the letters that don't set anything on fire. He and Edward formed a genuine rapport, which would matter soon in ways neither of them could have anticipated. What made Tidaldo useful, and what would shortly make him extraordinary, was precisely his obscurity. He was respected without being threatening. He was competent without having accumulated the specific enemies that competence in Rome reliably produced. The cardinals locked in Viterbo, whittled down by illness and bad weather, and Raniero Gatti's creative approach to ventilation, needed someone who belonged to no faction because no faction had ever needed him enough to claim him. A man without enemies was a luxury the deadlocked church had not previously considered. Now it was basically all they had left. Tidaldo Visconti was standing somewhere in Acre, likely discussing logistics or theology or the eternal question of who was responsible for which supply convoy, entirely unaware that the most important letter of the 13th century was already being written, addressed to him, and pointed east. It just had to get there first. On September 1st, 1271, after 2 years and 9 months of the most embarrassing organizational failure in the history of an organization that had survived the fall of Rome, the 6 delegated cardinals of Viterbo finally wrote a name on a piece of paper and agreed to mean it. The Committee of 6 had been the Church's last attempt at dignity. Rather than continue the full conclave's spectacular tradition of achieving nothing, the cardinals had delegated the decision to a smaller group, a kind of subcommittee of the apocalypse, tasked with producing a pope by whatever means necessary. What they produced was Tidaldo Visconti, not a cardinal, not a fully ordained priest, not even present on the same continent. A man who held no ecclesiastical rank that would normally qualify him for the position, elected to the highest ecclesiastical position in the world. It was the equivalent of a company's board of directors, unable to agree on any of their own executives, finally appointing a traveling consultant they had heard good things about and could not. Crucially, imagine anyone hating. The announcement was made. The vacancy was officially ended. Somewhere in Viterbo, one imagines a very long collective exhale. Then someone had to tell Tidaldo. This was the part that took weeks. The news traveled by courier from Viterbo to a ship, by ship across the Mediterranean, by land through the Levantine coast to Acre. Imagine the weight of that letter as it moved, carrying an entire papacy inside it, passing through hands that had no idea what they were holding. The Mediterranean in autumn was not a gentle traveling companion. The journey took long enough that by the time word arrived in Acre, the cardinals had been waiting in anxious silence for the better part of a month. And here is where history puts down its formal robes for a moment and grins. Multiple sources from the period, not all of them reliable but certainly all of them consistent in their enthusiasm, record that the news of Tidaldo's election reached him while he was using the latrine. The exact phrasing varies across accounts, but the image is stable. A 60-year-old diplomat on the far edge of the Christian world, in the single least ceremonial position a human body can occupy, learning that God's representative on earth would henceforth be him. Now, historians are careful people, and the latrine tradition cannot be verified with the confidence one would prefer before including it in a papal biography. But it has persisted across centuries for the simple reason that it feels spiritually correct. The entire election had been an exercise in the church being humbled by circumstance. That the culminating moment arrived in an outhouse was not so much undignified as it was thematically complete. What is not in dispute is the basic absurdity of the situation. Tidaldo was not a cardinal. He was not a priest in the full technical sense. He was not in Rome, not in Italy, not in Europe. He was in a city that was, at that precise moment, the last functional remnant of the Crusader project clinging to the edge of the Levantine coast. He would have to travel home before he could even be ordained. Before he could become Gregory X, he had to become a priest first, which is where things got logistically interesting. Tidaldo Visconti left Acre in the autumn of 1271 carrying the strangest luggage a traveler could hold, a papacy he had not asked for and could not yet officially wear. The sea voyage westward across the Mediterranean was, to put it kindly, a working trip. He was Pope-elect, which is a title with all the spiritual gravity and none of the practical authority. He held no formal orders that matched the position. He could not consecrate, could not formally bless, could not do most of the things people expected from the man notionally running Christendom. He was, in the most technical ecclesiastical sense, an extraordinarily senior nobody traveling toward the moment when he would become somebody. The Mediterranean in late autumn has moods, and few of them are hospitable. The winds off the Aegean are cold and insistent, the swells unpredictable, the ports dotted with curious locals and curious clergy who had all heard the news and wanted to see what a floating pope looked like. He stopped in various Italian ports on his way north, and at each one the scene repeated itself. Crowds, questions, a certain collective bewilderment at the sight of a man who was technically the vicar of Christ but had not yet taken his vows in any formal order. It was, by any measure, a spectacle. And Tidaldo, diplomat to his marrow, received it all with apparent calm. He arrived in Viterbo in February of 1272, 5 months after his election. 5 months of ship and road and winter wind, carrying the weight of an institution that had been leaderless for nearly 3 years. What followed was one of the more extraordinary administrative sprints in church history. Tidaldo had to be ordained as a priest, then consecrated as a bishop, then formally crowned as pope. All of this happened within weeks of his arrival, a kind of ecclesiastical express lane that compressed years of normal clerical progression into a matter of days. The church, having waited almost 3 years for a pope, was apparently not interested in waiting a single additional afternoon. He was crowned Gregory X in late March of 1272, in Viterbo, completing a journey that had begun on a latrine in Acre and ended under the full weight of the papal tiara. Remarkable, really, that none of this slowed him down. Because Gregory X, once he was actually Gregory X, had opinions. Strong ones. About how the church should be run, about the next crusade, and most urgently, about making absolutely certain that the catastrophe of Viterbo never happened again. Gregory X remembered the smell of Viterbo. Not metaphorically. The man had been in the Holy Land when the conclave began, had traveled 5 months to reach a city whose cardinals were still somehow bickering. He knew exactly what 3 years of institutional paralysis looked like from the outside, and he had no intention of letting it happen again on his watch. His papacy, which ran from 1272 to 1276, turned out to be genuinely impressive. He pursued crusade diplomacy with the focused energy of someone who had actually been to the places everyone else was arguing about from comfortable Italian palaces. He worked toward reunion with the Eastern Church. He managed the complicated politics of the Holy Roman Empire with something approaching grace. By any reasonable measure, he was effective. Which makes what he did next feel less like grudge settling and more like genuine statesmanship. In 1274, Gregory convened the Second Council of Lyon, one of the larger ecclesiastical gatherings of the medieval period. More than 500 bishops attended, along with representatives from the Eastern Church and various European powers. The agenda was sweeping: church reform, crusade planning, the question of Christian unity. Heavy business, all of it. But Gregory had one item on that agenda that he cared about with particular personal intensity. And he had brought the receipts. The document he produced was called Ubi Periculum, which translates with a certain grim poetry as where danger lurks. It was the formal invention of the conclave system as the world has practiced it ever since. And Gregory wrote it in explicit terms, with Viterbo staring at him from every sentence. The text references the Viterbo election directly. The 3 years. The disorder. The scandal of it. Gregory was not shy about naming the disaster as his reason for acting, which is either remarkable institutional honesty or the world's most official way of saying never again. Possibly both. The rules he laid down were specific and deliberately uncomfortable. Upon the death of a pope, the cardinal electors would be gathered in one place and locked in. The Latin phrase was conclave, meaning with a key. This is incidentally where the word conclave comes from. Every locked room election since has carried, embedded in its very name, the memory of a city that failed to lock the door. Once sealed inside, the cardinals would receive normal rations for the first 3 days. After that, only one dish per meal. After 5 days of continued disagreement, only bread and water. No wine. No delicacies. No comfortable negotiations over long dinners. The building would be sealed against outside communication. Personal servants would be dismissed after 3 days. The outside world could not reach in, and the cardinals could not reach out. Imagine being a cardinal in 1274, reading that document, and knowing that Gregory X had personally smelled what institutional failure produced. This was not abstract policy. This was a man with a memory and a pen. The practical effects were immediate and lasting. The conclave system, formalized at Lyon, would govern how the church elected its popes for the next 750 years. It would be modified, suspended occasionally, and refined across the centuries, but the essential architecture, the locked room, the shrinking rations, the enforced isolation, came directly from Gregory's constitution and from the particular misery of Viterbo. There is something almost cozy about it in the darkest possible sense. A man endures a humiliation he didn't ask for, travels half a year to inherit the consequences, and then methodically builds a bureaucratic structure designed to ensure that no cardinal ever again gets comfortable enough to forget that they have a job to do. The smell of Viterbo, one might say, was extremely motivating. Gregory X died in January of 1276, less than 4 years after his crowning. He had done what he came to do. Whether his successors would follow the rules he had written so carefully is, as it turns out, an entirely different and considerably messier question. Adrian V lasted 38 days as pope. 38 days. He used them to suspend ubi periculum. That is, to be clear, the entire papacy. A man became the head of the Catholic Church, looked at the carefully constructed rules Gregory had built out of personal humiliation and institutional memory, and decided what the moment really called for was less of that. He died in August of 1276, before he could formally replace the Constitution with anything. So the rules sat in a kind of legal limbo, suspended but not yet replaced, like a safety net someone had unhitched from the wall, but hadn't quite gotten around to removing from the building. Enter Pope John the 21st, who in 1276 formally revoked ubi periculum entirely. He was, by all accounts, an intellectually serious man. A physician, actually, which makes his decision to surgically remove the Church's only proven mechanism for timely elections particularly rich. He died in May of 1277 when the ceiling of his study collapsed on him. History, occasionally, has timing. And then the conclave to replace him ran for 6 months. 6 months. The air in that room must have developed its own personality by the end. The cardinals emerged looking, one imagines, considerably less confident about their decision to abandon the bread and water provisions. Gregory X, dead for over a year, had nonetheless managed to say "I told you so" with remarkable clarity. The pattern was now fully established. Relax the rules, suffer a chaotic election. Briefly remember why the rules existed. Install a new pope who, comfortable now, found the rules inconvenient again. Repeat. It took until the 1290s for anyone to break the cycle, and it required, fittingly, the most dramatic papal event of the medieval period to do it. Celestine V, an 85-year-old hermit monk who genuinely had not wanted the job, resigned the papacy in December of 1294 after 5 months of spectacular administrative difficulty. He walked out of one of the stranger chapters in church history, and his successor, Boniface VIII, walked in. Boniface was not a man who appreciated disorder, and he had just watched Celestine demonstrate what happened when the church elected someone without proper vetting or procedures. Within months of taking office, he restored the conclave rules. Ubi periculum came back, strengthened, and this time it stuck. What makes this entire 40-year saga quietly wonderful, in the bleakest possible way, is how perfectly it vindicates Gregory's original instinct. He had experienced 3 years of drift and embarrassment from the inside and built something specifically designed to prevent human nature from winning. And human nature, being what it is, spent 4 decades proving every single one of his assumptions correct. The cardinals who found the locked rooms uncomfortable were correct that they were uncomfortable. That was, and this cannot be stressed enough, the entire point. By the time Boniface finished his restoration, the conclave rules had been tested, suspended, and proven indispensable across 4 papacies, 2 ceiling collapses worth of institutional chaos, and more stale bread metaphors than anyone cared to count. Gregory's document had survived everything thrown at it. Which brings us, inevitably, to the question of what those locked rooms actually looked like from the inside. On the morning of April 2nd, 2005, roughly 2 billion people watched a chimney, not metaphorically. A small metal chimney mounted on the roof of the Sistine Chapel had become the most watched architectural feature on the planet. Black smoke meant no pope. White smoke meant the church had a new leader. The entire medieval machinery of the conclave had distilled itself across 7 centuries into a color-coded column of combustion visible from a piazza in Rome. Gregory X would have found this deeply satisfying. The smoke signals themselves have older origins than most people realize. Cardinals have been burning ballots since the 15th century, adding wet straw to produce black smoke and dry straw for white. The problem, charmingly, was that the colors were frequently indistinguishable. Black smoke looked grayish. White smoke looked grayish. The smoke of inconclusive papal elections looked, to outside observers, consistently and maddeningly grayish. In 2005, the Vatican finally added chemical compounds, potassium perchlorate and anthracene for black, potassium chlorate and lactose for white, because even the Catholic Church eventually concedes to chemistry. The locked room itself evolved in ways Gregory could not have anticipated. The Sistine Chapel, completed in 1481, became the standard conclave location in the early 20th century. Michelangelo's ceiling, painted between 1508 and 1512, now watches over every election, which means the most famous religious artwork in human history exists partly as wallpaper for a process born from medieval cardinals being unable to make decisions without coercion. The ceiling is extraordinary. The irony is exquisite. Modern conclaves still surprise people. The College of Cardinals elected Albino Luciani as John Paul I in August of 1978 after just one day of voting, which seemed wonderful until he died 33 days later. His successor, Karol Wojtyla, required 8 rounds of balloting and became the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. Benedict XVI emerged in 2005 after 4 rounds. Francis, elected in 2013, required 5. The rules codified by John Paul II in 1996 and refined by Benedict XVI in 2007 govern every detail, from the destruction of all notes to the prohibition of mobile phones. And yet, the fundamental architecture remains: isolation, food, time, and social pressure. The bread and water became catered meals. The removed roof became sealed windows. The basic principle that cardinals left to their own comfort will simply not decide remains intact. What the crowds in St. Peter's Square are watching when they watch for smoke is Gregory X's thesis about human nature still being tested, still holding. Robert's Rules of Order were published in 1876 by Henry Martin Robert, a United States Army engineer who had once been asked to chair a church meeting and found the experience so chaotic, so genuinely ungovernable, that he spent years drafting procedural rules to prevent it from happening again. One bad meeting. One afternoon of people talking over each other in a Baptist church in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the result was a manual that now governs hundreds of thousands of organizations worldwide. This is how institutional rules are born, not from wisdom, but from the vivid, humiliating memory of what happens without them. Humans do not build cages out of foresight. They build cages because someone already escaped. The United Nations Security Council veto, that maddening, conversation-stopping rule that allows any one of 5 nations to block the collective will of the rest, exists because the architects of the post-war world in 1945 had watched international bodies fail catastrophically when powerful nations simply walked out rather than be outvoted. The rule looks absurd until you know the trauma behind it. The filibuster, Senate procedure that allows a single senator to speak indefinitely and grind legislation to a halt, traces its modern form to responses against majorities that once steamrolled minorities without pause. Every rigid, seemingly irrational procedural rule in democratic governance is a scar. It has a story. The story is usually terrible. Gregory X understood this before any of them. When he emerged from that Viterbo palazzo in the autumn of 1271, thin and reportedly quite irritable, he had not simply endured a bad experience. He had watched the church, the most powerful institution in the Western world, humiliate itself for nearly 3 years because no one had built the cage. The cardinals had stalled out of pride, politics, and sheer comfort. They had eaten well, slept in their own beds, and found endless procedural reasons to defer. It took a crumbling roof, reduced rations, and the lingering smell of 17 men living in close quarters to produce a decision. The stench of that palazzo was, in its way, the honest smell of institutional failure. His reforms, issued in the Constitution Ubi Periculum in 1274, were not philosophical. They were personal. He had sat in the mess. He had breathed it. He knew that the cardinals would never choose discomfort voluntarily, so discomfort had to be written into law. This is the unglamorous truth about institutional design. The people who write the rules are almost always people who suffered under the absence of them. The procedure feels Byzantine from the outside. From the inside, from the memory of the chaos that preceded it, it feels like the minimum necessary barrier between order and catastrophe. Every strange rule has a ghost. Every bylaw with oddly specific language is pointing at something that actually happened. Gregory X died in January of 1276, less than 4 years after his election, having spent his pontificate trying to reform the institution his election had nearly destroyed. He did not live to see whether it worked. That part of the story comes next. Tedaldo Visconti was sitting on a toilet in Acre when they told him he was pope. Not metaphorically. Not in the soft, euphemistic way that history sometimes smooths over its more undignified corners. Literally, physically, mid-process, in the autumn of 1271, a man received the most consequential news of his life in the least ceremonious posture available to the human body. He had not campaigned for the role. He had not wanted it. He was a deacon, not even a bishop, which meant the cardinals had to essentially make up his qualifications as they went along. The church was that desperate. And from that moment, something extraordinary happened. He became, by most historical accounts, quite a good pope. He took the name Gregory X. He called a council, pursued peace between warring Christian factions, tried to organize another crusade, and somewhere between all of that, he found time to write the rules. The conclave rules. The lock the doors, cut the food, no visitors, no exceptions rules that would shape the election of every pope who came after him. He died in January of 1276 in the Italian town of Arezzo, having reigned for just over 4 years. Short by papal standards. Remarkably productive, given the circumstances of his hiring. His legacy, if you want to be precise about it, is a set of regulations about locking doors. That sounds diminishing until you remember that those regulations ended centuries of chaos and gave the papacy something it had never quite managed before: a reliable method for replacing itself. Here is the final irony, and it is a good one. The most sacred electoral process in Christendom, the conclave, the locked room, the white smoke, the moment the world holds its breath to learn who will speak for 1 billion souls, was designed by a man who was introduced to his destiny while indisposed. Gregory X knew, from the most visceral personal experience possible, that holiness and dignity do not always arrive at the same time. Sometimes holiness finds you in an embarrassing moment, and the only dignified response is to wash your hands and get to work. The word conclave comes from the Latin for with a key, conclave, a locked room. A man who had been trapped in a palazzo for nearly 3 years, who had breathed the stale air of institutional failure, decided that the lock was the answer. Not trust. Not virtue. Not the grace of God operating quietly on the hearts of good men. A key. The Holy See remains, to this day, a seat of power in every sense of the word.